everyone, welcome to my channel, Books, Gurrs, and Purrs. My name's Leslie, and today we're going to have a March wrap-up. This month I focused on Sandra Cisneros. I read Woman of Hollering Creek, The House on Mango Street, which is very beloved, and I also read Women Without Shame. And I listened to that on audiobook through the Libby app. I didn't get a physical copy. And since I borrowed Women Without Shame from the Libby app, I'm going to talk about that first. And also because out of the three works I did read, that was the one I enjoyed the most. So Women Without Shame is a poetry collection, and there's a mention of Joy Harjo in the poetry collection, and I'm always fond of authors mentioning other authors in their work. There's also just so much going on within a particular collection. The author writes about murdered women in Juarez. Also talks about something on the opposite of that, which is making love. Talks about celibacy. The parts that I really enjoyed about that poetry collection is that there's this not just erotic overtones, but it's really put out there in a funny, candid way that I actually really enjoyed. And the author also does talk about like sexual exploits and relationships, as well as a mother's perspective on sex. And there's one poem that really stuck out to me, and it's called End of Day. And with that poem, the author is just going for a walk and making observations about what everyone else is doing as she walks by them, and I absolutely love that poem. It actually reminded me of that French movie Amélie, where she's just a young woman just living her life in France, and it's really just these quirky observations. Just something about that reminded me of that French movie, I think it is. I hope I'm not ruining it. I'm pretty sure it's French. And I absolutely love that poem. That's what really stuck out with me the most. And actually, if the author chose just to focus on poems like that and put it out as one particular work, I think I would have liked that collection more. Yeah, the author's just kind of like, it's not focused on one particular subject. It's kind of like all over the place. Or let's say if she wrote a whole collection talking about murdered women in Juarez, then I just feel like it would be like, I don't know, more cohesive and consistent. And so I think that's my only like little critique about that poetry collection. But besides that, I really enjoyed it. I also did read Woman Hollering Creek. A friend of mine is a fan of Cisneros, so I got myself this copy, and I sent her a copy in Spanish because she tends to really enjoy reading in Spanish. And the story of La Llorona is something that I grew up with, or I should say, like, you know, my aunt would always scare me with that in childhood. So I thought I would enjoy this, and I also really wanted to see what the author was trying to say by using that story and how she worked with that, if that makes any sense. And with Woman Hollering Creek, I really started to notice that I'm not really into Cisneros's storytelling. I did appreciate certain stories, like I think it's Holy Night. Something that the author consistently does talk about is just young girls, not women, young girls being taken advantage of. And that's something that she also talks about in this story, and the cycles of that happening. And I appreciated that. And so this is where like my conflict comes into play with reading her work, is that the subject that she's talking about is definitely important. And I'm glad that Sandra Cisneros is someone that adds that to the literary canon, because it's just important to talk about. And also specifically she'll talk about things with one's own culture and experience, and getting down to like those specific experiences is so important, because I know I've said it before, but with I can never say this right. With specificity comes universality. And so although she does talk about like child pregnancy and sex within a culture, I just have a difficult time getting in tune with her writing style. And that brings me to House on Mango Street, which is such a beloved book by so many. And in fact, after I read this book and I felt like there was something I wasn't really tapping into, I watched other people on YouTube talk about this book. And so I just don't think that this book is particularly my cup of tea. Everything she talks about in this book is important, and I'm glad she wrote this book also for a younger audience. And so just to recap this book is about a young girl, and it is a coming of age story. So she does grow up throughout the book, and the story is told through a series of vignettes. It's a young Latina girl in Chicago and her experiences for her, but also her community specifically, and how there's this, not toggling, but a struggle between two cultures, whatever the American culture is, and plus the culture of the people in the community, whether they were born in the States or have come from a different country and now live in America. And so what she does really well is she has a strong point of view from writing from this young girl. She does that really well. She does that also in, I want to say, Woman Hollering Creek, and maybe one story in Women Without Shame, where she just really has that voice down from a young person's perspective. I think that the fact that this is told in a series of vignettes and has simple prose that are also poetic probably serves someone of a younger age well when reading this story. And I am a big fan of books that let go of a specific plot and then just focus on character, and yet somehow it didn't work for me in this book. Somehow there's this slowing of the pace, and it's not the actions of what happens to each character that is not engaging. It's hard to engage or feel like I'm dropped into a world when I don't feel like there's like a forward movement to the storytelling. And she does talk about so many important things in here. That's why it's like such a conflict. So as a reader, I couldn't get into it, but it's such a conundrum because everything that she talks about in here and other people that have analyzed this book point out just how so many topics are tackled in here. For instance, you know, also with one's own community, if you grew up in a way where there's this like patriarchal society, very like machismo, where women don't really have a lot of choices, or those are like removed from them, and on top of it, if you're somewhere and you don't know the language well, so you're struggling to connect, which isn't what happens to the main character, but it does happen to other characters. Or just how there's a cycle of telling someone very young, you just need to get married right away. There's that tradition of doing that. So there'll be very young girls, not even women yet, being married off to older men and that being accepted. Which leads me to the quote that I wanted to share because I thought it was really important, and it's the character talking about their grandma, or I should say great-grandma. My great-grandmother, I would have liked to have known her. A wild horse of a woman, so wild she wouldn't marry, until my great-grandfather threw a sack over her head and carried her off, just like that, as if she were a fancy chandelier. That's the way he did it. So she's just being told of a story about how her great-grandmother was stolen, and that's accepted in the culture to be treated like property. And from there, you just see how that kind of mentality gets passed down. And later on, the character is assaulted, and no one's told her about her body or the opposite sex body or so many things. And so if she doesn't know enough about herself and what she's comfortable with or what she's not comfortable with, how could she put into words that this thing happened to her, was forced on her, and she doesn't really know where to go from there because she's brought up in a culture that treats women like it's wrong of them to talk about. And to just one other note to go back on how I couldn't engage with the work, and I found that there was a pacing issue. I think it's because there's no sense of like tension and release within the flow of the storytelling, and so that's what would make me not want to engage and continue reading the book. I read the entire book, and once again, I completely understand the value of it. It just really wasn't my cup of tea, and I wanted to give another example. There's a book called Calling for a Blanket Dance that I read, I want to say, maybe in November, very, very recently, and I'm already forgetting. I can't remember if I read it this year or at the end of last year. I absolutely love this book. I guess you could actually put this in a category in a way of a coming of age story. It really is from a character being a baby into adulthood. And the way the story is set up is it engages you because you're reading about the character, but not directly, but through the periphery of other characters. And you really read about what this young boy character has witnessed, and it makes the reader question, who is this person going to grow up to be, and what kind of choices are they going to make with everything that they've witnessed and experienced, and people have been there for them or haven't been there for him. And so I think that beginning of a question is like what helps create like a build up and a tension away. Even though sometimes when we talk about tension, it sounds like we're thinking about like a thriller or something. I don't mean that. I mean in terms of like, how does this grab you? What about the story is making you engage and continue to like flow on throughout? And so that's something that Oscar Hokia really did well, that I didn't really see happening in The House on Mango Street. It just felt like I was just witnessing moments, but not necessarily being pulled into like a ride of a story. And something else that House of Mango Street touches upon that I know said was important, but I just didn't feel moved, was she does touch upon like cycles of abuse cycles of a society that really doesn't have your back because violence and abuse is a part of the norm, is Trevor Noah's Born a Crime, which is a memoir. And even though it is about Trevor Noah, the focus isn't so much on him, but what he witnesses and his experiences with his mother. And something that works really well with Trevor Noah's storytelling is because he is a comedian. Comedians do this thing where they will set up something, and then there's a punchline, and then there's a callback later on within the storytelling, and it could be to something that happens in the beginning or the middle, or just kind of like bullet points, if you could think of it like that. And so early on in the story, he does talk about people in the community that were abused by the men in their life, and then they would get pushed to a point where they would end up the women in their life would end up committing violence against the men in retaliation, right? And this cycle would continue because there's nowhere for people to go for shelter, in a way. That's the best way I could put it. And there's not a community that supports like breaking that cycle. And so he lays a groundwork really early on to say that. And then we're actually just witnessing him and his mom and his brother go through that very same thing, but in detail, because then he's just telling his story of the life that he led from a young age into adulthood. And it was just so effective and so moving. And I also think it has to do with the character details. And although Trevor Noah's writing about real people, I would have to say, I'd have to use that as an example of character detail, of bringing personality and life into his writing, because just because the author's writing about real life people does not mean it's going to translate into the written word. And he does that really well. As where with Sandra Cisneros, I didn't feel that way. I didn't feel like I was being connected to the characters, I guess I'm trying to say. And so I didn't feel anything emotionally, even though these terrible things were happening to the characters in the book. I just wasn't grabbed. So that was a bummer, because I've actually really enjoyed the author themselves. Whenever I see them speak, I mean, man, I love watching the author's interviews on YouTube, wherever I could find, whether the author was on PBS Hour recently, or any, what do you call it, book chats that she has at bookstores promoting her books. It's just strange that I enjoy hearing what she has to say so much. I find her engaging in that way, but somehow it doesn't translate to me reading her work. So that was a little bit of a bummer. It just feels like a conflicting way to talk about an author when you're reading their work. And I actually can see the importance of what they add to the literary canon, but not enjoying their work. It's very confusing. And with that said, I did not read Caramello, which is like 16 hours. I was gonna listen to it through the Libby app because I don't have the book. But by then, I already read 3 of her works, and I didn't really gravitate towards any of these 3 really. So I decided not to listen to it, not to read it, unfortunately. Let me know what you think about any of these books, or if you've ever had that experience of hearing such great things about an author, but then when you pick up their work, you find yourself disappointed. Not necessarily in the work, but that you didn't connect with it. Yeah, that's all I have to say. I wish I could think of something else. But that's also why I didn't have individual book chats for the month of March. I just also don't like to be that person that just butchers someone's work because they work really, really hard on it. And on top of that, my schedule was kind of crazy for March anyways. So just doing a wrap up was like the best way to tackle these books for this time. Anyways, with that said, thank you for watching. Let me know what you think below. Like, subscribe, all that stuff. And I'll talk to you later.